So after a good amount of time of looking forward to seeing this movie, I finally got around to watching 28 Years Later, and it was somewhat disappointing, to be perfectly honest. Now, an interesting thing is that I actually watched 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later for the very first time a week before watching this movie. At the time of recording this review, I'm in the process of editing another video of my thoughts on those two movies, so if that comes out before this video, then definitely go watch it. But for right now, to keep it brief, I would definitely say I enjoyed watching these two movies, although for very different reasons. 28 Days Later I definitely enjoyed for its choices to present its world and atmosphere and themes and characters in a true survival setting. 28 Years Later was a kind of so bad that it's a good movie to me. There are just so many incredibly stupid decisions in this movie, it's endlessly entertaining to imagine how much it fails throughout every single scene. Now this new movie 28 Years Later isn't as good as 28 Days Later and certainly not as bad as 28 Weeks Later, although it certainly does do some things well and does a handful of things not so well, so I'm not even going to try to talk about this movie without going into spoilers, so if you don't want to see spoilers, then I would suggest you leave. The word that I would use to describe my experience while watching this movie would be odd, because there are just so many weird decisions that this movie makes creatively and narratively. One kind of interesting funny thing that I want to talk about in this movie is from the very beginning of the film and its opening title sequence where there's some text on screen and it decides to show us some information. It basically says that the virus spread throughout Europe, but at some point all the militaries were able to push it back except to the UK where they decided to quarantine it then. And you kind of just have to ask, well, at what point why would they just quarantine it to the UK specifically and not just bother to go after it, considering the fact that they took over most of Europe. Now very clearly this was done to retcon the ending of 28 Weeks Later, and that's not something I necessarily blame on this movie, but more or less just 28 Weeks Later, but still it is kind of odd to think about. There were certainly many bizarre editing decisions in this movie, and I honestly don't know how to feel about some of them. One thing that I found very off-putting about this movie would be how it splices in old footage of the past history in England battling to current day footage of them battling zombies. I suppose it was trying to communicate the idea in this situation that the UK is forced to revert back to primitive time and weaponry, which isn't really all that necessary to be perfectly honest. I just found it a weird editing choice. Another editing choice that I found to be a little bit more interesting in this movie would be the bullet time effect thing in this movie. Essentially when a zombie gets shot in the head with an arrow, it pauses and goes to a separate camera angle of it being shot in the head at a different angle. And I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I kind of enjoyed that aspect to the movie. And don't get me wrong, it can be overdone throughout this movie, but at first I thought it was okay, that's kind of cool and kind of interesting. Danny Boyle is very clearly a very visual director and he does some great sequences throughout his movies. This isn't one of his better ones by any means, but it is an interesting choice and it wasn't the worst thing ever, and I kind of welcomed it, to be honest. Now with that being said, there are definitely other points in this movie where the editing and visual sequences and presentation is not up to par from what I've come to expect. Unfortunately, in his recent career, I feel as if Danny Boyle has lost his touch when it comes to his visual elements of his movies. Not to imply that there aren't any redeeming qualities throughout this film in terms of visual elements. There are some incredibly striking images in this movie that are definitely very well presented on a purely aesthetic level. It's just a point that the editing cannot be as well fleshed out and thought out as his other movies, and leading to some awkward moments where it's just kind of unclear with what is happening. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the story itself. Now the story in this movie did not exactly have my largest investment into it. Now first off, I want to say that the child actor's performance in this movie was not great, but not terrible, if that makes sense. And there are definitely points where it feels a little bit better than others. And in turn, there are points in this movie where it feels a little bit worse than others. I would say that everyone else's performance in this movie was overwhelmingly fine, to be perfectly honest. Now the actual story itself is the pretty big dividing part of this movie for me. I certainly do have a good amount of issues with it, so I'll talk about that. So at one point in the story, the dad begins to tell the story of the doctor on the mainland and he describes him as being insane. It's a flashback sequence to when the dad was a teenager and he went exploring with his friends on the mainland. They come over a hill and see him from a distance stacking bodies in neat little stacks, and he also has a fire going where he's burning people. And the entire idea that this scene is trying to communicate is that he's some insane guy and doing some weird ritualistic stuff or whatever. And he also says that at one point he started waving to the boys and invited them to come down, and just from that point on everyone in the island thought he was insane or something. And throughout this entire scene I just thought, okay, the reveal is going to be that he's just doing some memorial service to these dead people and he's showing respect to them or whatever. And in all honesty, it is kind of confusing that the entire town would think this. Like, yeah, sure, it's weird that he'd be stacking all these bodies, but at the same time somebody could just easily investigate it and just quickly come to the conclusion that yeah, he's not doing anything too weird, he's just kind of building a monument and showing respect to the dead or whatever, and that there's no real reason to fear him or anything. Another very odd narrative decision in this movie is when the mom and child character are going throughout the mainland because the child character is looking for the doctor to take care of his mom. At some point they meet up with a Swedish trooper who was dropped on the mainland and crashed his boat and his entire team got killed. I believe his name is Eric, and they talk a little bit, and then he decides to go with him to try to find this doctor character, and he's probably only in this movie for 5 minutes, and then immediately after that 5 minutes he gets killed off. It was just so incredibly jarring that this character was immediately introduced and then immediately killed off. In my mind, what I think they were trying to do is try to recreate the sequence and events with Mark in the first movie. In that movie he's killed off very quickly after being introduced as a main character type figure, and the reason why it's so impactful in that movie is because it plays with our preconceived notions of being introduced to this character at that particular time in the beginning of the movie and thinking that they're gonna go somewhere together. And the fact that he gets killed off so early really does manage to bring a lot of character emotions to the height as well as establishing tension. But in this one it's just so incredibly jarring and doesn't capture that magic at all. It's just we introduce the character for 5 minutes and then immediately killed him off. And while we're on the subject of Eric as a character, there's a really funny moment that I want to talk about in this movie. So right when he gets introduced to the boy and his mother, he has his phone and it's dying of battery. So he decides to use the last few minutes that he has with his phone to look at some old photos, and then when his phone finally dies he just decides to throw it away and says, well, don't look me up anymore. Like, really? You're never gonna need that ever again? You can't possibly think of a situation where this device could be helpful to you? You can't think of a single resource or way to recharge your phone? Now this doesn't really have any effect on the plot, but I just found it really stupid that he just decides, oh, my phone's out of battery, there's no way I can do anything with it now, and just decides to throw it away. Alright, so I want to go into more of the dynamic and relationship between the main characters of this movie, most notably the boy and his parents. So after the very first time the boy and his dad come back from the mainland after going out, they have a celebration, and basically during that celebration the dad gets a little drunk and goes away and starts kissing another woman, and the boy falls and sees him. And the next morning he kind of confronts his dad about it and basically says he wishes that his mom would die. The dad just gets so upset and angry that he eventually slaps the kid, and the kid just basically tells him to get lost, so he does. And after that event, that's when the kid decides to take his mom to the mainland to look for the doctor that he heard about earlier. And eventually when they meet the doctor basically tells them that the mom has cancer and that she's gonna die soon enough. So the mom intentionally has the doctor immobilize her just a little bit, so she basically walks into the zombies and gets voluntarily eaten, I guess, because she doesn't want to suffer. And they then cremate her body and basically have her skull and then added to the monument that he's been building. And during this whole scene of basically the memorial and the mother's death, there's some really fascinating scenes with some great cinematography, editing, overall atmosphere and presentation, but during this whole thing I was just really wanting to care about the characters. In all honesty, throughout this entire movie it feels like the dynamic is just really underdeveloped and there's a lot of character and personality missing from them. In all honesty, I just really didn't care about anything that happened to them. Thinking back to 28 Days Later, it definitely felt like the two main characters had a much more believable story and arc and dynamic with each other. Not to say that it was a terribly written narrative, but I just really lacked an emotional connection. Anyway, so after the mom dies, the boy makes his way back to the island to drop off the little baby that they found earlier. He leaves a note with it and basically asks his dad to look after her, and I think in that note he also says something about him forgiving his dad and says that he's not mad at him or something. And that part of the story really felt rushed and underdeveloped to me because in all honesty there's no real reason why he should have been making up with his dad at all. The last time he saw him he slapped him and the kid told him to get lost, and I don't really understand why there should be a sort of reconciliation at this point. Not to mention their mother just died, so I don't really understand why he cares about his dad so much right now. You'd think he would be pretty upset right now, and I think that would honestly be a better angle for this character. Because in this note he also says that he wants to explore the mainland some more before he comes back, which is an idea that is sort of touched on earlier in the movie, so I guess it makes sense, but just feels a little weird that he chose to make that decision, especially now that he has this baby. But whatever, he makes this decision, he wants to explore a little bit and yada yada. And I'll go back to this point, but I definitely feel as if the baby in this movie is just so unnecessary to the entire plot and emotion of the movie. It just really felt so unnecessary, and it felt better if it tried to focus more on the mom and son characters. And not to mention something I really want to talk about, the very ending of this movie is just so incredibly bizarre. So for a little context, in the opening scene of this movie, it opens up with some kids watching a TV show in a room, and you can definitely feel some tension in the air of what's happening. And this is right when the pandemic is breaking out. So his son gets away from all the other people that are infected and goes to his dad, who's a pastor at a church. And his dad's basically praying and basically saying, oh, Judgment Day is upon us, and gives him a cross and tells him to run as he just decides to get eaten by the zombies. So the little kid's hiding in a little hideaway hole underneath the ground, and then it cuts to the opening of the film. And there it transitions into the dad character making breakfast, so in my mind I thought, okay, there's going to be some point where it shows that it kind of confirms that he was the kid in the beginning of the movie, because there's a scene where they run into a church on the mainland, so I thought, okay, this is the scene probably where he says, oh, this is where my dad died, and yada yada, here's my backstory. But about halfway through this movie, I realized that they never actually confirmed that he was the kid in the beginning of the movie. So at the very end of the movie, the main kid in this movie is getting chased by a bunch of zombies, and he comes to a roadblock in the road. He starts shooting some zombies with his arrows, and then all of a sudden this older guy comes out. He's wearing the cross upside down, he has like 5 people with him, and they're all gymnastic, and then they start killing zombies in front of him. And he basically ends the movie by saying, hey kid, why don't you join my side, it'll be a lot of fun. So I guess they're setting up for a sequel. So I'll see you guys at 28 decades later. And the overall presentation and music when these characters showed up was just so goofy and weird, and honestly I just don't really truly understand the entire point of this. It certainly made an impression in my mind, no doubt, and that's probably the most memorable point of the experience. A few more things I want to touch up on. I mentioned how the editing was well done at some points and not well done at other points, but there are other points where it just basically kind of does flashbacks of showing things that didn't even happen that long ago in the movie, which really just made it feel repetitive and kind of pointless in all honesty. The overall use of music and score in this movie was fine, I guess. The creature effects and makeup was good and whatever. For the most part, those are just technical aspects. Now, from my understanding, there's a lot of discourse going on about this movie. I'm understanding that a lot of people are enjoying it. I'm understanding a lot of people are not enjoying it. And I definitely personally fall into the latter category of that. But with that being said, it should all be taken with a grain of salt, and I would recommend people who are interested in this movie to go see it. Because who knows, maybe you'll find something that I didn't. Anyways, for right now, this one gets a 5 out of 10 because not terrible, but not good in my opinion. Anyways, that's it, 5 out of 10. See you all for 28 decades later, I guess.